Good morning. My name is Tony Allen, and as many of you know, I'm the president of Delaware State University. I am particularly pleased to have so many here today who are not typical to this conversation. We have a weekly forum and have been doing so since the pandemic for our entire university community, but we have many participants on the phone who are interested in the issue and concerns before us. For those of you who are regular participants, particularly my students, I want you to know that we are going to have a special student forum for all of you regarding our emergency relief funds tomorrow. Look for the time of that particular forum to be on social media and via email. But today is an important moment in our nation's history. I think everyone has watched the events of the last week, but more importantly, the events that have plagued us for so many years. Let me start off by saying I am a proud father of 3 sons and 1 daughter, and I am a proud president of what I believe is the best historically Black college and university in the country. And at this moment, we cannot be silent. Very important that we lead fearlessly and boldly. And we do that recognizing that we have a responsibility to serve and care for each other in the best and most thoughtful ways. I know that there is no silence around this country at the moment, and we're not sure how long that'll last. But we do know that we can't simply protest. We must not only let our voices be heard, we must have a plan and path forward. At Delaware State University, we want that plan and path forward to be how we do business every day. And one of the ways we do that is to encourage candid, sometimes very tough dialogue around some of our nation and our community's most pressing problems. Today begins that journey. Dean Michael Casson, who is the College of Business Dean and a dear friend and a Dover boy that I care about deeply, has agreed to facilitate this particular panel. And one of the reasons I asked Mike to do this is because I know how deeply he feels about these issues, and I know the work that he has put in for more than 25 years on these specific issues for places like Dover and Wilmington and other places in Delaware and across the country. I'll turn it over to Mike in a second, but what you'll know and see is that you'll hear from a few of our experts who happen to be alumnus of this great university, as well as a subject matter expert in our College of Health and Behavioral Sciences, and hopefully some student voices as well. It's very important that as we recognize the number of young, particularly African-American students, we have at our care, folks who are entrusted in our care every year, that we are speaking to them as well. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Dean Casson. We'll get into the panel with the group before you, hopefully get to some questions that I know we're all facing, and continue to remember that we literally are just beginning a conversation long overdue and must include action. With that, I'll turn it over to Michael. Michael, I think you're on mute.
My apologies. Thank you again, President Allen. Good morning, Delaware community. My name is Michael Casson, and I'm the Dean of the College of Business here at Delaware State University. Thank you for joining DSU to discuss our path forward during these extraordinary times. And as extraordinary as these times may be, the symptoms of America's illness has persisted since its creation. In 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stated the following in his speech titled, "The Other America." Certain conditions continue to exist in our society, which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. It has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And so in a real sense, our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in a position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention. Thus the question, my friends, for us is how do we become the voice of the unheard? Specifically, how does DSU and HBCUs around the country, how can we serve as the catalyst for change so desperately needed within our Black and Brown communities? Today's forum will serve as one of many first steps toward the building of an impetus for change, starting in Delaware and plugging into efforts of similar nature and individuals of like minds across the country and around the world. We are fortunate to have leadership in our midst who are ready to sound the clarion for change and the struggle for equality. Today's panelists are representatives of that leadership that is required to move our communities forward and our nation forward. We'll start with our panelists, and I will provide a small background on each panelist, and then we will go into a Q&A. This Q&A will last approximately 30 minutes, each panelist having an opportunity to respond to 1 to 2 questions, after which time we will move into a Q&A session, and then from there, closing remarks from President Allen. I will start with the short bio of one of our students, Corbin Witherspoon. Mr. Witherspoon is a rising senior majoring in engineering and physics with a minor in mathematics, again, here at Delaware State University. He is very active on campus, and he serves as president of the Men of Color Alliance and is the founder and president of the Faithful Black Men Association. In his roles, he has embraced action steps to help create refined male leaders and close opportunity gaps in the Black community. Our second student panelist, Samaj Hazard. Samaj Hazard is a rising junior from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a middle education major, and our current SGA vice president. Chief Harry W. Downs, Jr. Chief Downs has been the chief of Delaware State University Police for the past 9 years. Prior to becoming chief, he served with the Delaware State Police for 26 years, retiring as a major. During his tenure with Delaware State Police, one of his many successes was establishing the Rural Community Policing Unit, which reduced crime below the national average, built community relations, and revitalized communities throughout Kent and Sussex County. Dr. Gwendolyn Scott Jones. Dr. Jones is the department chair for psychology and assistant dean in the College of Health and Behavioral Science at Delaware State University. Dr. Jones is a clinical psychologist with subspecialty in forensic psychology and oversees DSU's Trauma Academy. She worked in Delaware's prison system for approximately 11 years as a mental health provider. Colonel Vaughn M. Bond, Jr. In 2017, Colonel Bond was promoted to the rank of Colonel, Chief of Police, becoming the highest ranking African-American officer in the history of Newcastle County's Division of Police. Colonel Bond has 28 years of progressive law enforcement experience and held every supervisory rank within the Division of Police. Finally, we have Mr. Horace, Mr. Matthew Horace. Mr. Horace is a 28-year veteran of federal, state, and local law enforcement, ascending to the Senior Executive Services rank in the United States Department of Justice, managing local, regional, national, and international investigations. During his law enforcement career, he worked in every state of the United States and many foreign countries. A standout athlete at Delaware State University, he was afforded a tryout with the New York Giants, earned a BA in English from Delaware State University, and an MA in Human Resource Leadership and Management from Seton Hall University. Horace also served as a paid on-air subject matter expert on law enforcement and security within CNN, NBC, ABC, and wrote for the Wall Street Journal Crisis of the Week column. So thank you all panelists for attending this event. So Mr. Horace, I will start with you with the first question. What motivated you to use your platform and experience to write The Black and the Blue? Mr. Horace is not available? Okay, I will move on to Mr. Weatherspoon, our student panelist.
Hello?
Yes.
I was saying it was clear to me back in 2014 and 2015 that the shooting incidents involving policing and Black men were becoming more than just one-offs. And there was something that many of us that worked in the ranks for a number of years knew that it was something that we could write about or talk about or raise awareness. So I felt that given my platform at the time, it was my obligation to write about it and sort of educate people as to the nuances of law enforcement, the types of things I saw within my 28 years, and why we were seeing these deaths moreover.
Thank you. Mr. Weatherspoon, what would you say to those who feel like turning to violence is the only solution?
To that, I have a short story actually. So when I was young, I believe it was elementary school, and I first learned about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. I remember I came home and I asked my mama if she remembered this or how she felt about this. And all she had to say was that she remembers watching it on the TV, hearing about it in the news, and how it affected herself and the community. And the first thing I asked her was what she did next. So the only thing I have to say to people who think that violence is the only answer is, what do you want to tell your kids when they ask you, what did you do after this? After the George Floyds, after the Breonna Taylors, after the Vaughn McDaniels, after everybody who was unjustly killed by police, or anybody who was a victim of systematic racism? Do you want to tell them that you were unheard and turned to riots, or that you use your hands for violence, or that you use your mind to come up with creative and innovative ideas to change? Remember the history, because we're living in history. When our children and their children learn about this time, we're going to be learning about this summer and the pandemic and the riots and the racism that is happening now. I will ask them how they're going to be remembered, if they want to go about doing it the right way or fall into rage and anger, or follow the lead of the people who came before us and do it the right way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weatherspoon. Chief Downs, a question for you. To protect and serve is distorted in this racially charged moment. What does this mean to you, and how can you reestablish these values to the young men of color, specifically Black men at DSU?
Good morning, Dr. Casson, and good morning to our Delaware community and DSU community. That's a great question, and I think that we need to take that piece by piece. And when you talk about the words protect and serve, those words have been around since 1963, since they were, developed by the LAPD, and police departments have used that as a base to what we should do to our communities. And so we've done pretty well at protecting. We know what that means. What we need to do to protect. So we'll protect life, we'll protect citizens. Sometimes it's convoluted is when, how do we serve? And it's amazing that a word that simple is causing a lot of in our communities today. And so I'm going to just talk a little bit about how to serve and how not to serve. And when we talk about serve, I think coming in the door, you need to serve respectfully, compassionately, fairly. And if you don't have that coming in the door of a police agency, then you shouldn't come in the door. I don't think that is something that we can train you to do. I don't think that is something we should train you to do. As I said, that's something you need to do coming in the door. That's the basis of good service. And we talk about service, and service can be different between jurisdictions. So how I serve here at Delaware State University and our campus community and our students here, it's going to be a little different than how Colonel Bond serves in Newcastle County. Um, it's basically the same, but specifically it's very different. And so we have to know, what does it take for us to serve in our jurisdictions? What do our people need? I don't think you can serve people if you don't know what they need. And so we have to find out from our communities, what do they need? And that can be a challenge for Delaware State University, because every year we have different people coming into our community. But we try to find out what is the need of our community and how can we best serve that community. And once we find out what they need, we'll try to bring in other stakeholders to work with us to provide those needs. That's a basis for good service. And when we talk about serving our young Black men, if we can provide that basic service to everyone in our community, we're providing a good service to those young Black men also, because they support our young Black men in our community. Now, how not to serve. You might not think that me being a police officer that I've had these experiences on the other side of the fence. And so I'm also a father of a Black son. And it is a little unnerving when you get a phone call one night and your son is stopped by a police officer who has followed him from a certain community and asking him questions. Why did you come out of that community? Well, I'm gonna make a long story short. He came out of that community because that's where his grandmother lives. And he held me on the phone because of his fear of what that police officer was going to do. That is how not to serve your community. I think it is also embarrassing to police agencies that there is one segment of our society that has to teach their sons how to survive a police encounter. Police departments should think, why does one segment of our society have to teach, or why do they have to talk to their sons how to survive a police encounter? We should not have to think how to survive a police encounter. That's embarrassing to us. That's how not to serve your community. And let me be clear, and for anyone who's taking notes on this, you are not serving your community when you can clearly execute someone in about 8 minutes and 46 seconds. You're not serving your community. So when we think about protecting and serve, we know how to protect. We now need to learn how to serve properly.
And actually, as you spoke about the needs for our community, I'm gonna move into a question for Colonel Bonds. So the question for Colonel Bonds is, how important is cultural competency in law enforcement, and what forms of training are provided to law enforcement in this area?
Good morning, and I wanted to say thank you to Dr. Allen and you as well, Dr. Casson, for the opportunity to come before this panel, this group of people who are interested in having this type of dialogue. In terms of policing, I think cultural competency is up there in terms of training, up there in the same realm as firearms training, weapons defense training. And the reason why I say that is because many officers will go their entire career and will never utilize their firearm. Many officers have a very minimum amount of use of force incidents during the course of their career. However, every day, officers come into contact with individuals from different cultures with different backgrounds. And it's important that as a police officer, you have some working knowledge of those different cultures, an understanding of how they react to different events that take place in their life, understand how you can better communicate with them, and recognize the issues and problems that they are confronted with within that culture. So as a police department in Newcastle County Police Department, that is a high priority for us. And it has been in the 29 years that I've been here on this police department. there's no way that we can effectively serve our community if we don't focus on cultural diversity. Our communities are made up of numerous cultures. And so to be effective, we have to train in that. And we start that training right from the very beginning, from the onset. And matter of fact, if I can back up, we actually look for that in our applicants. Because many of the issues and problems, things that we see, they start off because of issues in the initial hiring process. So those individuals that have backgrounds, different backgrounds and diversity, we tend to focus on and lend our efforts to hiring those individuals and bringing them in. Once they're in the police academy, we make it a point to have members from different cultures and communities come in and to talk to our recruits about what their issues are, how they see law enforcement. There are many in the, for instance, the Hispanic community who do not trust law enforcement. When all of that rhetoric was taking place about sending people back and ICE was on the move and doing the things that they were doing, we had the Hispanic community, Latino community, afraid to come forward to law enforcement. And so it's important for us to break down those barriers and give them the opportunity to engage our department, our officers, so that we can be more aware of what's affecting them. We also continue to do that training throughout the course of in-service training that we schedule throughout the year for our police department to ensure that we have a good understanding and more so a great relationship with the leaders from those various communities. So anytime we have an opportunity to go before them, I take advantage of that so that I can go hear exactly what is their issues, what their concerns are, and we can have this ongoing communication. So it's critically important. I put it up there right along with firearms training and weapons defense training.
Thank you, Curveball. Actually, I'm gonna move into Dr. Jones because I think she may be looking to weigh in on this question as well, but also I have a specific question for her. Dr. Jones, how do historical trauma impact the African American community and police officers psychologically?
Good morning to the panel and good morning to everyone listening. Tragic deaths of African Americans have been at the hands of police officers for years, and there's been a lot of controversy between race and policing. However, African Americans have been traumatized inherently and inconspicuously for generations. There was a researcher by the name of Dr. Joy DeGruy who created a theory called the post-traumatic slavery syndrome in 2005 that explained a set of behaviors, beliefs, and actions associated with multi-generational trauma experienced by African Americans. You see, PTSS is what we call it. It's not a disorder, but it's a theory that explains to us why centuries of slavery and systematic and economic problems have taken place, as long as, and also mental illness has taken place in our culture and has had an impact on traumatizing African Americans for a period of time. It's a way of thinking, and not only just for African Americans, other people, such as the police, often look at this culture and see this culture in a maladaptive way. We also, Dr. Casson, have to take a look at microaggressions that are happening. When I was talking to you about inconspicuous racism and inherent things that inherently when we have trauma, that we don't know about it, but there's also microaggressions. There's three forms of microaggressions. And sometimes we can see it, but we don't know what we're looking at. You also have micro assaults, micro insults, micro invalidation that happens. And these are subtle or indirect forms of discrimination that African Americans often have to undergo. In addition to that, it's also prejudices and biases that people have towards a culture. One of the things that I've noticed about some of the policing, and I tried to wrap my head around this as I cringed when I watched the television show of George Floyd begging for his life and being taken away, not in an ambulance, but in a hearse, is that I had to really think about what's happening in our culture. And I want people to hear me that not all Caucasians or people who don't have our same symbolic carrier are racist, but we all have prejudices and we all have biases. But there's a something with law enforcement that's also inherent. And I've got to believe and think that some police officers believe that they are immune from civil liabilities and criminal charges when they're out here conducting these type of maladaptive behavior. And the Colonel Vaughn indicated that we need to look at cultural diversity. But we have to look at cultural diversity for individuals to become culturally aware, but there should also be ongoing education. When I worked in the state, I also used to provide mental health training to the cadets over at the state police department. That should be ongoing, not just for your 1081s. And, that's police talk for people who have mental disorders, but it should also be for cultural diversity. It should also be to help people understand that when you're working with people, you're working with people who also may have trauma. We're also working with people who have some underlying mental health issues that have not been addressed. And I also want to say that, some of the police officers themselves have become compassionately fatigued. They're working long hours. They're doing different things. That don't justify taking a life. But what we need to do is find a way to have better police reform, where we're able to also check in with the police officers to make sure that they're okay mentally, that they're doing fine. So I believe that the post-traumatic slavery disorder or syndrome that I was making reference to has a strong impact in the African American culture. It also creates a great deal of fear. And when you see young African American boys take a look at TV and they see that this man is down here begging for his life, that makes them afraid of police officers. We have to do something, not now, but right now.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. And to that point, I want to speak directly to Mr. Hazard, our young male, African-American male student panelist. Mr. Hazard, how do you feel? Can you talk to us about how you feel after these actions have happened and transpired in our country?
Thank you. I believe it's safe to say that simply in very elementary words, we're afraid. We're afraid because it's risky when we walk out the house at this point. I mean, it doesn't matter if you have a suit or tie on like how we all have on now. It doesn't matter if you have the qualifications. It doesn't matter what your background is. Our lives are at risk because of the color of our skin. And we're just afraid because every time we walk out the house, it's a gamble. We don't know what's going to happen. So as a black male, that's in college and is so exposed to the world, sometimes I have to hope and pray that I can make it home to see my mother. Sometimes I have to hope and pray to make it home that I can see my family. Sometimes I have to hope and pray that I can make it to point A to point B. And at the end of the day, the best way we can solve this issue is, like I heard it before, is we have to have a voice and we have to have numbers. We have to come together. And it's outside of whatever's happening outside, whether it's the looting, whether it's the screaming, the riots. We have to come together and make it known that, hey, we're here and we're Americans as well. And we deserve the same rights as our white Americans, as our Black Americans, as our Hispanic Americans, as our Asian Americans. We deserve the same rights as everybody. Because we're Americans, we contribute to society just as much as Caucasian people contribute to society. So as to come back to the question, we're afraid because we don't know what the outcome is going to be when we step out the house. Thank you.
Hey, Dean Casson, it's Tony. Dean Casson, it's Tony. I just want to pick up on that. And Samaj and Corbin, thank you for being here and extending that very, very candid voice. So to Colonel Bond and Chief Downs and Brother Horace, all of whom have been in the business and are working in the right ways. When you hear a young man like that in Corbin talk about just the fear of it all, how do you translate that to the officers that have been under your direction, and how they need to look for those kinds of needs and how to serve properly? I think that's important that we hear from you on that. So I'll start with Colonel Vaughn. I think you might be on mute, Colonel.
Yes.
There you go.
Well, first of all, I would like to say that when I hear that, I am fully aware of the sentiment of the young African-American males, the middle-aged and the older African-American males, and their thoughts on law enforcement and their interactions with law enforcement. And every time that I hear that, I am extremely disappointed. I'm disappointed that the young men feel this way, and I'm disappointed in the actions of law enforcement over the years. I thought that we were going to take a turn for the better several years ago, and it seems like every time we take a few steps forward and we do some good things, someone comes along and they do something such as the cowards did out in Minnesota. And it sets us back. It continues to pull the scab off of a wound time and time again. And as a leader of the Newcastle County Police Department, it's important that I convey my feelings and being transparent and my concerns with this department, and stress the fact that we will be professional in our interactions with individuals, that we will hold officers accountable. If you color outside the lines, you will be held responsible. Our professional standards unit, AKA Internal Affairs, will be assigned the case to look into. It's not something that I'm going to tolerate here in Newcastle County Police Department. And I think that that's the stance that departments across this country have to take. Too many times, department leaders have turned a blind eye to situations and incidents where they know their officers were wrong. The FOP has been, in some ways, and I'm talking about many of the FOPs, have been very supportive of some of the actions that are without question. Ugly is a word that comes to mind, disrespectful, and you question whether or not the actions of those officers were rooted in racism. It's time for us to be transparent in law enforcement. It's time for us to send a message. It's time for us as African Americans and diverse communities to say, you know what? Why not join in law enforcement? Why not get in law enforcement? If I get in law enforcement, I can affect the change that I want to see. We can work it from the outside, and you can also work it from the inside. And my hope is that we will have young men, such as the men that are here, consider it. I came on to make a difference. The officers, many of the officers I work with, came on to make a difference and to stand up for what is right. Sometimes when you have deep-rooted issues, you have to go inside. And so I can assure you, the young men here and the young men that may be watching, that at the Newcastle County Police Department, I will stay committed to our values. I will stay committed to what I believe in, and that is a fair and equal and just service to all. It pains me. Last week was a week that I was, like I said before, extremely disappointed. But together, I think together, if we as a community and we as a police department come together hand in hand, we can overcome this. But I'm not foolish enough to think that it's going to happen overnight.
Mr. Horace, thank you, Colonel. Mr. Horace, could you respond to that as well? And also, could you talk to us a little bit about your background and your experience and what led you to become a law enforcement official?
I have to agree with the chief. Number one, if you want to be a part of the solution, then you get involved and make yourself a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. I grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and when I was a sophomore at DSU, I was attacked in an unprovoked police attack by a canine officer, and the FBI investigated. I was not arrested. I was not detained. And soon after the incident, my parents and others learned that, number one, the report that was written indicated that they didn't know what type of injury I had and how I sustained the injury. And number two, the report that was written had me listed as a suspect and not a victim. So very early on, I kind of understand, particularly being in Philly day in and day out, the kind of things that happen. And to the point to the young man's question earlier, just understand that for all of us, and including me, if I win and when I do get stopped by police, I'm equally nervous, right? And I'm nervous because I'm not sure who's showing up to the side of the car. And many times when I produce and present my credentials, the conversation changes, right? But up to that point, I recognize that I'm just as vulnerable as everyone else is. So I think it's incumbent upon us when we're in these leadership positions, we have to make it clear to our commands what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable. I was really energized by the chief of Chattanooga a couple of days ago. And many of you might have seen it online, where he basically told the whole department that if you agree with what happened in Minnesota, you can turn in your badge and gun today. And that's the type of leadership that we need in policing. I'm equally energized this week because this incident differs from many other incidents that we've seen, and I know my colleagues will agree. In many other incidents, we've seen that gray area where people then want to step out in front and say it was wrong. This time, it appears to me, through my colleagues at the IAACP and Noble and other organizations, everyone is saying is wrong, right? The question becomes, what do we do moving forward? So I think we continue to work towards 21st century policing principles. We continue to communicate to all people that we know, Black, white, green, Spanish, everyone, how it feels to be African American when we get stopped by police, right? How it feels to be targeted. I can't tell you how many times I've been stopped and I've asked the question, okay, over and beyond the fact that I gave you federal credentials, why did you stop me? And then they give you the reason and you're like, well, that's not accurate, right? But the question becomes then, who wins the battle at the stop? So I'm so glad to see that Noble and other organizations are having these programs where we talk to young men and young women about how to get through that stop and how to move on and live to file a complaint.
Brother Horace, make sure everybody knows what Noble is. I mean, our audience might not know Noble.
The National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, which, as I understand it, Brother Vaughn and I know that the chief belonged to as well. So these are resources that we have available to us. And two, I share your concerns. When I get stopped and I see those lights, I'm equally as nervous as any 22-year-old, even today.
Thank you, Mr. Horace, for that insight, that incredible insight, actually. I'm going to turn it over to ask the question of Chief Downs. Chief Downs, could you speak to that fear and also potentially speak to how that fear potentially plays out differently on a college campus?
Yeah. I appreciate Mr. Horace also bringing at that point of even when we get stopped, that we go through that fear. I know when I get in my car coming to work, sometimes if I'm not in uniform, I have my gun, make sure I place my gun in a spot where it's not going to be seen, because those first few minutes, if I am stopped, it's a little unnerving. And so, I think it's kind of sad that we have to do that. It really saddens me when I hear young men like Mr. Hazard talk about, experiences such as this. And that is something I'm very passionate about here at our university, and how our students are treated here on our campus. That will not be tolerated here at Delaware State University. And I think all police departments, the leadership of their departments, that is the only stance that they can take. It will not be tolerated in their departments. And I think when they see incidents that even kind of rise to this, and usually there are things that happen in your department that are very small that people know about. The people in the department, they need to talk about these things. They need to tell leadership what's going on in the departments. We can't support these in the department. And that's why I talk a lot about the cultures of police departments, that we have to know what the culture is in the police department. And police departments have to look at their culture and say, if this is the culture in my police department, it has to be changed. Whoever is creating that culture in my police department, it has to change. There's no way that I can have this type of culture in my department and have it affect other members of my department, because I will tell you that you can get very good people in your police department, and if they become a part of that culture, they wouldn't sour like the rest of the people in the department. And a lot of times, it's one or two people, and they have a big voice in the department. And those are the one or two people that people have to stop supporting. They need to be out of that department. And then young men like Mr. Hazard and people like all of us who are people of color, we won't have that fear. And then police departments have to start talking to the community more, joining the community more, let them know what their police department is all about, and let the police department know what we are really there for.
Thank you, Chief Downs. I'm going to ask one last question of our panelists, and this is going to go to Dr. Jones. Dr. Jones, you've heard the fear from our young male panelists. You've heard the response from our officials, our leadership in law enforcement. Could you talk to us about what exposes African Americans to police violence?
You know, I just want to say it just really broke my heart to hear you, Mr. Hazard, talk about how afraid you are that you may not make it home to your mother. Looking at all the African American men who are panelists, I don't know what it's like to be an African American man, but as an African American woman, I can promise you one thing, that I'm going to serve as a change agent to do my part to help this cause so that we can educate people about this kind of violence. And back to your question, Dr. Casson, what exposes African Americans to police violence? It is historical constructs about African American culture and learned maladaptive behavior from police. As I indicated before, sometimes, as Chief Downs indicated, it might be one or two that might be problem or have toxic behavior in a police force. But if you don't do anything and you're a bystander looking at that maladaptive behavior and you don't speak up about what that person had did wrong, you're just as guilty. So, you know, what exposes a lot of the African Americans is just how people misperceive the culture in looking at who we are as a people. So it's always ongoing education to begin to educate people. You can't judge a book by its cover. If you see someone that do not look like you, that's not in a suit, don't mean that that person don't have value. If you have a person and you come up to their car and that individual is listening to hip hop or rap, don't mean that that individual is a bad person or uneducated. I mean, I like Future. He's a rapper, okay? But more specifically, if you come up to my car and you hear this music, are you going to judge me by the music that you hear coming out of my car? Okay? These are the things we have to change. And we change that through educating people about culture. We can't just do it one time a year. It has to be ongoing.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. We're going to turn it over to our audience and give our participants an opportunity to ask some questions of our panelists. Mr. McMillan, our CIO, will be fielding those questions and providing those questions to our panelists. Mr. McMillan.
Thank you, Dean Casson. For Matthew Horace, why don't police nationwide acknowledge that this is a structural, systematic problem and not just a few bad cops?
You know, I've often said that if it were just a few bad apples, we wouldn't be having these discussions. But when you start to multiply the numbers of complaints and assaults and bad acts and bad actors, it ends up being more than we think. So I have a leadership theory, and my leadership theory is that sometimes culture eats strategy for lunch. And what that means is even the greatest leaders, no matter what the organizational tempo is, sometimes are fighting against a culture that is just too unwielding to manage. So I know for a fact in our culture, there is a history of racism in the way we approach things. But in answer to your question, quite frankly, many people don't want to acknowledge it. If you see the response to the Minnesota incident now, some departments are coming out and saying there is a history that's causing this problem. And night after night, riot after riot, some departments are still saying, and some FOP lodges and others are still saying, it's just a few bad apples. It's not all of us. I would beg to differ. And I think part of the healing and part of healing trauma is going to be acknowledging to the Black community that this issue is systemic, broad-reaching, historical, and impactful.
Thank you. For Chief Bond, how do you assess the situation of community relations between police in Wilmington and the Black community? What are you doing to build relationships and diffuse animosity?
Okay, well, just to be clear, the city of Wilmington is policed by the Wilmington Police Department, whereas I am the chief of the Newcastle County Police Department. And so I really cannot speak to what the Wilmington Police Department is doing in terms of their outreach into the community. However, I can say that from the Newcastle County Police Department, one of the things that I have done since taking over as chief of police, I have reinstituted the importance of community policing. I am not naive enough to believe that simply going out there and reducing crime numbers is a gauge on how well you are doing with the community. The community is suffering. Many of the people that are out here are being affected by a host of issues. And as a police department, I think we have a platform that we can use and use in a manner that can be uplifting and interactive with the community. And so our focus has been on doing various community outreach engagements in terms of simple things such as our Nico, our companion dog, working with the Special Olympics, working in the communities with the coat giveaways and the book bag drives, and going out and being a part of the community. Right now, we have numerous requests from community members in this COVID-19 era where graduations aren't being celebrated. And I know that there's some police departments that have said that, listen, we don't have the time for it. But for us in Newcastle County Police Department, we're going to make the time for it because we are part of the community. And it's important for us to be seen out there and celebrate these accomplishments of the young men and women who are graduating from college or high school. It's important for us to be there. The elderly lady who celebrated her 100th birthday party. So be there, be present. And those are the kind of things and so many others that we do that help to change the perception that people have of law enforcement. I just think that when it comes down to it, many of the officers who enter into this profession come in here because they want to help and they want to serve. And we have them. It's time for us as leaders in law enforcement to recognize that, to celebrate those officers and to encourage it. And when we recognize the efforts of those officers, it picks up. And people understand that it's not just about playing cops and robbers. This is about going out there and going beyond and doing doing more than what is expected of law enforcement.
I think this is a pertinent question based on the discussions that we have. I have always been scared whenever I leave home that I might not make it home to my family. I do not know what to say to the police that will not be misunderstood. Any response to that from our police?
So you're saying the question is that they are afraid, you said?
Yeah, so basically if you look at the question, they're afraid, and basically when being pulled over, what do they say so that they are not misunderstood by that officer?
Okay, what I would say is, as part of the Noble Delaware chapter, we have a program called the Law in Your Community. And as it was mentioned earlier, I think it was Chief Downs, I initially was saddened that we have to have a program like this and programs such as surviving encounters with officers. It's a sad commentary, but the fact of the matter is it's necessary. And that should be readily obvious by some of the events that have taken place over the past several years. My suggestion and my advice to all young people is that when you are stopped by the police, that you comply with the commands that are given to you. At the time of your detention, that's not the time when you want to hold court. Okay, provide the information, answer the basic questions that you're going to be asked. If you feel that your rights have been violated or the stop was unjustified in any way, it's important that you file a complaint with that police department and follow up on it. If you're not getting the response back from the police department, no one is talking to you, no one has called to ask you questions about that incident, then you need to take it to local community leaders, politicians, and run it up the chain until you get some response from that police department. I think if you're a juvenile, you should immediately go home, contact your parents or your guardian so that they can do the same thing. It's important that as police departments, what I found is there's so many people in the community that come into contact with officers who act outside of policies and procedures, but because they feel nothing will be done, they just lay back and they don't make any reports, they don't file any complaints. And what that does is that empowers that officer to continue on with their actions in that manner, being unjust and unfair, because no one has put a stop to it. So I encourage everyone that if you have an issue or a problem, you have to demand that that officer is investigated. Me, myself, I want to know about it, because that person might be on our radar screen and we might need to take the necessary actions to get rid of that officer.
Yeah, Dr. Casson, I'd like to echo that point also. A lot of times people think that when you have incidents like this that, and they reported to that officer supervisor, that nothing happens. Things do happen when they're reported in police departments. And as Colonel Vaughn said, to go to his IA and things will happen. Here at Delaware State University, if any of our students, something like that occurs at Delaware State University, come see me. We're a small enough department that you can walk into our police department and you can say, I want to talk to the chief about this. Now, we might have to push it back a little bit, go through the proper steps through an internal affairs investigation, things about that. But as Colonel Bond said, we want to know about these things because an officer might be on our radar screen at some point. We want to know about this and take the necessary steps, but never think that things do not happen once it is reported within that police department, or at least most police departments.
To Chief Downs, in 2012, the Supreme Court ruled that the police don't have an obligation to protect. How do we trust police knowing this? And how does this affect hiring, training, and accountability?
Well, I think that within our police departments, I think that we feel as though in the police officers, we do feel we have an obligation to protect from a police department's position and our community position. Colonel Bond and myself, we just got off a call with our Delaware Chiefs Council and we discussed things like this. I think in Delaware and our chiefs of police across the state, we do feel like that is an obligation to protect our communities. So either you might get a ruling on that at a Supreme Court. I think on a local level, at a police department's level, we still feel as though we have that obligation.
Thank you, Chief Downs. As we draw near conclusion of this panel, I want to thank the panelists for their service, their insight, of course, and their leadership. And I also want to inform our participants in our audience that, again, as I stated at the top of this discussion, this is one of many first steps that are going to be required to pull our community out of this. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to our president, President Allen, to provide closing remarks.
Thank you, Dean Casson. I want to thank the panelists in particular. I can't tell you how important we thought it was to make sure that our students were present in this discussion. So to Samaj and Corbin, both of whom I know represent this university incredibly well, thank you for joining. To Colonel Bond and Brother Horace, your insights are incredible and timely. And the fact that you are Delaware State University alum makes us all quite proud because you are very much a part of this conversation, not just here, but in the national landscape. So thank you for all that you're doing. it's probably worth noting to this community that Brother Bond in particular is the first African-American chief of police in Newcastle County. And sometimes when you're first, you may go a little quietly. You can see that he is not going quietly. He is representing all of us in a very, very real and substantive way. To Chief Downs, I just want to thank you for all that you do. I know your ethic of service and commitment to the university community. And I know what that means. Students might not always know that, but I know what that means relative to making sure that we are just not just protecting and serving, but teaching. And I think our police department does that as well. So thank you for all that you and your team do as well. And to Gwen, your comments, I just can't say enough about the quality of your insight. I know it's specifically related to your field, but it matters. It matters extremely. And I think as we continue to position ourselves here at Delaware State University in the local and national landscape, what I want folks to see is we have the culturally competent subject matter experts on this campus and around us throughout this country that we need to mobilize in a more and deeper and more compelling way than we ever have before. This is just one example of how we can do that. I am taken back to what Corbin's grandmother said to him early. What do we do next? You know that we are trying to make sure that we are deploying our resources in the most thoughtful way. For those who may not know, Delaware State University is engaged in any number of partnerships locally and nationally that deal with some of the country's most pressing problems. We have developed a Center for Trauma that actually Gwen Scott Jones is running. We have developed a Center for Neighborhood Revitalization and Research that is specific to bring our intellectual discourse and research to some of the most distressed communities in Delaware. We have a number of programs that are specifically designed to uplift and bring forth the next generation of whether that be teachers or nurses or corporate professionals. Those are things we're intent on changing the face of our local community and changing America. And you can expect that we will continue to do that in every field of human endeavor under our profile and portfolio. And let me close this way. Behind me are the names of my three sons, Jacob, AJ, and Brooks. And I can tell you that while AJ is 27 years old, he had to talk from me a long time ago. I still have to have that talk with my 10-year-old and 7-year-old, probably more than ever before. In fact, this weekend, as we watched the news together, I had to explain some things to them for the very first time about what it means to be brown in this world. I also know that I'm not alone in having to do that. I know that many of you have brown sons. And I know that most of you care and are in close contact with young brown and black folks. Don't forget that at this particular moment. And then really, really ask yourself, wherever you are, whether you're at the university or in another field of human endeavor, what are you going to do next? It's that important. So with that, I leave you with this video. I will remind the students that we will have a student-focused forum tomorrow on our relief fund efforts. And I encourage you to remember that it really does matter. It all matters. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you real soon.